So we fast forward a little bit, the Roman Empire, and then we have the beginnings of the legalization of Christianity. So up until this point, we did have Catholic classical teachers. We had St. Jerome, we had, I'll get to those in a second, but we had Christians, Catholics that were in hiding, that were classically trained. The problem was at the time you didn't have any children being classically trained as Christians. There were no classical Christians at the time because of hiding. Right? And those that did have the knowledge that were Romans that had converted to Christianity had to keep that in hiding. So there wasn't the opportunity for us to really even begin with classical instruction. But with the Edict of Milan and the legalization of Christianity, you had Christians, Catholics start to pop out of the woodwork. Another thing to note at that time is we had St. Jerome, St. Augustine, St. John Chrysostom, and others that came in already with a classical education that they had received as Romans at the time. So we didn't succeed here at the beginnings of a Christian classical education because we rocked and because we started educating our kids. It's because the pagan classicist came in, became Christian, and started actually educating our own children. So we really say that the father of Christian or Catholic classical education is St. Augustine. So there we go. All right, so with St. Augustine, at the time as Christianity had become legal, they're trying to reconcile classical education with Christianity because there are some clear things that are at odds. For starters, a classical education was still about pursuing your own means, pursuing your own ends, doing it for your own gain, even if wisdom was involved in it. And it was about might was right. So you had the classic, the more trained you became, the more educated you became, the more power you held over others. And so St. Augustine comments about this, as you know of the history with St. Augustine. He was classically trained. He was silver-tongued. He knew how to speak in court. He could often say, I could convince you of an evil and succeed, do so wonderfully. And so Augustine comments, oh my God, what miseries and mockeries did I experience when obedience was proposed to me as proper in a boy, in order that in this world I might prosper and excel in tongue science. Oh, I like that, tongue science. Which should serve to the praise of men and deceitful riches. St. Augustine reads the words of St. Paul. For the kingdom of God is not in speech, but in power. Now, power is a correct translation, but if you read the Latin and you read the original words, that's virtute, which can also be translated as virtue. They're one and the same as far as teaching goes, but it's to be clear that when we mean power, we don't mean worldly power. We mean from the virum, manliness, or rather to be the most human, the most perfect that you can be under God, fulfilling what God's plan is for you. So this begins to structure the way that we make classical education Christian. So St. Augustine has a book called De Doctrina Christiana. Keep on thinking Garrett's going to judge me on my pronunciation. All right? But no. All right. At least Father's not here. All right. Now, he says this is all pointless at this point because you first have to be... it's not about Christians doing so that they can become greater, so that they can become more mastered in the world, but it's so that they can be taught true wisdom, and that true wisdom is only attainable with holiness of life. All of the education doesn't matter if you don't have holiness of life, both holiness of life to begin that education, holiness of life to sustain it, and to pursue it. If holiness of life is not at the forefront of why you're receiving this education, it's pagan. It's a pagan classical education. So you notice that a lot of these 7 look like the gifts of the Holy Spirit, mostly, but you have St. Augustine saying this is the path in order that one should approach their education in order to make the most of it and to keep God in their sights. First, fear of the Lord. All right. Second, piety, keeping that duty before your eyes. Third, knowledge, knowing that anything that you learn is in service to God or coming to know, love, and serve God. A resolution to keep to that knowledge, or a resolution to keep your eyes on education for the sake of wisdom and not education for the sake of vanity. Counsel, purification of heart, and of course, wisdom as its ultimate goal. All right, so I think I skipped something somewhere. But needless to say, Augustine begins to systemize those, but they're not really in a particular... Hold on, No, that's right. All right. No, they're not out of order. I deleted the slide. All right, so Augustine keeps more or less the classical arts that Plato and Aristotle had put together. We have arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, music, logic, and then we added on the rhetoric that Romans have. But you notice we're still not to 7. And so at this point, fast forward from the times of Augustine to the times of Aquinas, we're now in the 13th century, and you start to see a rift appear. You have what the church has been known as at this point as mystics of prayer and of most wisdom coming from divine revelation and contemplation. And then you have what comes about known as the new rationalist, believing that they can attain things by reason, and there's nothing wrong with that. But there were problems. First of all, shocker, the mystics were leading holier lives. They were praying and contemplating, whereas the new rationalists were leaning onto their own understanding. They thought that they could entirely go about faith by their own reason. We see that crop up again later. Also, Aristotle's works had been in hiding or had been buried away for hundreds of years, and the only people that had access to them were the Greeks and the Muslims. And so they had translated Aristotle's works, but badly, right? And also inserting their own commentary, and the Christian rationalists of this time were just reading them and taking them at face value, all right, without considering Aristotle's words. So for a while, there was a rift between the mystics and the rationalists until Thomas Aquinas, all right?
Woohoo! Scared me.
I was about to say that. I named a kid after him. Now, there's a reason why Thomas Aquinas is who Thomas Aquinas is. Everybody just thinks, oh, smart dude, you got to like him. All right, no. Thomas Aquinas is the height of a Catholic classical education. Why? Because Thomas Aquinas would sit there in ecstasy and prayer and write poetry and write psalms. He sat there and had a prayer contest against another fellow saint, to where the saint had to rip up his own copy in the prayer contest because Aquinas' was holier. All right, imagine that. One saint losing against another. All right, it'd be like heaven. Now, so Aquinas was pious. Aquinas was mystical. Aquinas was poetic. But Aquinas was also rational. And so you could say that beyond any of Aquinas' logic or explanation or reason, Aquinas' personal witness is what led to the two camps being reconciled. That in one person they could see the combination of mystical devotion and reason. And so Aquinas in his own life marries the two. And that's the significance not just of himself, but his greatest work, the Summa Theologica. It's a book that binds the two together. You can, if you've ever read parts of the Summa, you know it can look perfectly rational for pages on end, and then you get that's just cause on a particular page. I remember reading that and think question 10 or 11, Aquinas just writes, I think all of the explanations have spoken for themselves. The end. All right? And may have thrown the book. Now, you see Aquinas, you see the Summa Theologica, we now have everything together in one place. Revelation and reason. Remember those two words, revelation, reason. If we're Catholic, we know them already. So then we have a curriculum now. So we believe, and I don't have it on this slide, but even though the exact wording is used in the Baltimore Catechism centuries later, Aquinas had put it in his own words. An education, a Catholic classical education, is to know, love, and serve God. All right? That knowledge of God leads to love of God, leads to service of God. Obviously, it doesn't have to be purely progressive like that, but to know God is to love God. We can't believe what we do not know. And so Aquinas and others, we found 4 different ways in which we can know God. Reason, creation, experience, and divine revelation. All of these fall under knowing, which lead to loving and serving. So first we have knowing by way of reason, which we came to call the trivium. There's grammar, all right? And again, similar to earlier with arithmetic and geometry, it really should kind of go logic then grammar, because man's inclined to want to reason, to reason things out. But how can he reason if he doesn't have the words or the grammar to be able to do so? So before you can even reason, you have to have the grammar, the building blocks. We then have logic itself, reasoning. We then have rhetoric. Again, rhetoric here in the way it should be. And when you look at this slide and the next slide, they really are the height. So with Thomas Aquinas, with the Summa, comes the height of Catholic classical education. It's literally all downhill from here. So the next part is going to be heartbreaking. So you have rhetoric. Rhetoric is not, once you found your truth, let me convince you of it. It's once I found the truth. Once I found a piece of truth, let me convince you it's the truth. We still see this in science. If you have someone come across, discover a new theory or try to form that new theory, they have to convince you of the truth of it. They don't say, I'm convincing you of this new theory because it's my truth. It's because they think that it is the truth. This is something natural to the world around you. There's none of that relativism within science. We can know him by our creation. So here comes the engineers. All right. So we look around and by creation we know God. And it doesn't have to just be we look at the bird and we know God. Though that's wonderful. It's we know God by his numbers, by his lines, by his shapes. When we lift up our eyes to the stars to study the stars, it's its own form of praise, because we're studying God's creation and it reveals his wonder. When we build a bridge, we realize how infinitely hard that is. And we think first you just throw a plank over two cannons and we're just going to walk across, right? All right? So no, but we realize the more we get into it. C.S. Lewis talks about this. Just look at a table. Like look at that table right there. And then you think how simple that table looks. And then think about structuring the table, drawing the table, the material, the wood. The more you get into just looking at that table, the more complex it becomes. So, knowledge of God's creation leads to love of God. Then we have third, experience. So I always feel like this is the heaviest category. So with experience, there's this wonderful sign I just saw in the Carm thrift store the other day that said, learn from others' mistakes. Life's too short for you to make them all on your own. So as humorous as that is, that's the reasoning within Aquinas and others at the time for experience. We learn from history so that we can use it to reflect on our own actions. We learn from geography so we can see how the physical earth has impacted events in history and men's actions. You think of wars, of the reasons why one war has been lost and the other gained. You can very clearly see there. If you have a pass that a troop or soldiers have to cross versus not having to cross if it's across a plain, you see how physical space, especially as Catholics with us being incarnational, can impact things. Literature. Literature is the mirror to the soul. St. John Newman says that the Bible is the book of God, science is the book of nature, and literature is the book of man. So we can look throughout literature, not just like with history where we can see what has happened, but you can see every scenario, every story tried out. And when we read a story and we look at a character, we're not looking at that character, we're looking at ourselves. We're looking at mankind. Was that?
Through the character.
What was that?
Through the character. You're seeing yourself going through the character.
Through the character, yes, exactly. So, and when we say this, we mean good literature. That's not to say that all literature has to be Shakespeare, but good literature in that it has a positive ending. It's not that it can't have good or evil, but that it doesn't glorify good or evil. So, example I heard the other day is, Great Gatsby is great to read, but how many of us read that because we're trying to learn to become like anybody in that story? When really it's just a misery fest of all the characters in the story. Not a bad book to read, but it's not something you would see in a classical school because you're trying to learn by example from characters within the story. You can struggle and you can sin with those characters in that story and rise up with those characters in the story. But the idea is that you're looking to them as models to get back up again. And you see this with Christ himself with the parables, which is micro-literature. Philosophy, where you see all the great discussions that have been had across history, condensed. Divine revelation. And this is the key thing again. These three, 1 through 3, were reason. And then fourth, and what is most important to a Catholic classical education, is revelation. All right? All of this brings us to knowledge of God, but we stop here. We cannot make it any further than here. Even theology is informed by revelation, which with us as Catholics is not just sacred scripture, but sacred tradition. So don't forget about this slide, even though there's a lot on there. All right. But then you take that textbook series that Aristotle had earlier, and you expand it. You start to get a list. It's not that everything is on this list, and it's not that every student K through 12 reads everything here. Some of it's distilled or excerpted, but this is the bank that you start to see. You see added to it Cicero. You see the arithmetic I was talking about earlier with Nicomachus. You see Euclid, Ptolemy. The Iliad, the Odyssey are now on there. You see Shakespeare in the Divine Comedy, which even though this is after Aquinas' time, I added that back on there so that you could see the list. You see that you pick the best, the finest, the ones that actually look up towards God for wisdom instead of just reading something for misery's sake or negativity. Augustine's Confessions and the Summa Theologica. So again, these are not things that every student would have to read front to back in 12 years, but this is the bank that all of that comes from. All right, and then another important part, and this comes from Augustine and Aquinas as well, virtue. I know you can't really read that from here. I'm trying to talk Sonia into painting it larger and more readable. All right. I'm on the very back list. All right. I get paintings from her as birthday and Christmas presents, so I have to wait 6 months at a time. Now, but you had the 7 virtues, which, faith, hope, and charity as the theological, and you have justice, prudence, temperance, and fortitude as the cardinal. But then it got to the point in the Middle Ages that it branched out to 50 sub-virtues, not for the sake of being tedious or scrupulous, but it was born out of love, out of diligence. It was, if you ask a student to recite Shakespeare to you or the Bible, they'll roll their eyes, but you ask them to recite Justin Bieber, all of a sudden they can quote every single lyric from all of his songs. And so it was that, but they have a love for that second thing. And so that's what we had here. There was a love of virtue at the time to where every part of virtue was mined. It was a fruit that could be plucked to learn from, so that you could go to fortitude and say, I need to work more on my patience. I need to work more on temperance and go to which section of temperance that you'd want. So there was a love of this at the time, and this is still within that Catholic classical education. So you have reason, revelation, and virtue, forming good habits. All right? And so this is what, won't talk about it right now, but with Chesterton Academy, this is one of the mottos we are looking at for the school, but it also summarizes it up inside of this presentation. Suprema Ecclesia lex salus animarum. All right? The supreme law of the church is the salvation of souls, and you could modify it to the classical education as well. The supreme aim of education is the salvation of souls. You can't say that enough, because including in Catholic education, even within their era of Protestant education, there has been the lack of focus, the loss of focus on salvation. It becoming masters of education instead of masters of education for the sake of salvation. C.S. Lewis said, every time we study something new, it should be somehow saving our soul just 1 inch more. And so that should be our priority. Thomas Aquinas says that the slightest knowledge of heavenly things, the slightest knowledge of large things, of divine things, is better than the largest knowledge of pointless things. And so you can see that especially with the virtue tree in the last slide. They took that seriously up to the height of classical education. It's better to focus on every little thing, mine for every little nugget zealously, than to focus on all the tedium.